I went to Wellington, where I had done my third year as a student, as a physiotherapist in January 1964. The charge physiotherapist was Barbara Tomlinson. I was allocated a role in working in the surgical wards 23, 24, 25 and occasionally ward 26. And I did pre and post-operative work together with some other bits and pieces that come out of surgical wards that were perhaps more directly related to muscle function, etc. in those days. I was very aware that the school that I had left, who was predominantly staffed by people who had done a teaching diploma in England, who got bursaries, I think, or some sort of assistance from the New Zealand government to come over and work in the school for a 1 to 2 year period, that had sort of rather run dry. And the school had started a fledgling postgraduate teaching diploma based on the English model. Frank Whedon was into his second year of doing it in 64, and at the end of that year, Barbara Tomlinson, towards the end of that year, came and said to me that Billy McLeod, who had come back from England herself, having done that teaching diploma in my third year, 63, was now principal of the school and was interested to know whether I would consider going back to Dunedin to do a teaching diploma. And remember, the school was run by the Otago Hospital Board then, and staff were employed by the hospital board. And so even the student teacher was quite well placed on the salary scale compared to a new graduate. I can remember, I think I got £754 a year in 1964 in Wellington, because I can remember I used to get about £12 a week in the hand. And I would go on to £955 if I became a student teacher. Now, that was by no means the only consideration. I spent quite some time wondering whether I really wanted to go back to Dunedin for a start, whether I wanted to go and do any more study, all sorts of considerations as to what I would do. But in the end, I went back to Dunedin to commence this postgraduate diploma that was compiled of bits of things from the med school, who were very cooperative when you look back and think about it. We were to do physiology with the second year medical students and a little bit of physiology with the third year medical students, all in the 1 year. We were to do education with some of the postgraduate diploma of education that was in place at that time. We were to do and develop our own sorts of programs within physiotherapy school, and we were to do some teaching. Renee Wordy was also starting the program at the same time. So we were sent off to the education department, where we did this, when I think about it, quite bizarre things, given that we were going to become physiotherapy teachers. We did the history of education, we talked about the philosophy of education, we did the psychology of education, such as it was in 1963, and I've still got 1 or 2 of the books, and it's laughable to read what they thought then. We did the theories of Rousseau and laissez-faire teaching, which didn't ever really work because of the strict format. I had quite a few little arguments with Billy McLeod as a student teacher. In particular, the students were meant to stand when a teacher came into the room, which, given that I was 22 and some of the students were at least my age or older, I found to be very uncomfortable. I taught massage and I taught electrotherapy in that first year. I couldn't ever really come to teaching massage quite as it had been taught to me 2 or 3 years before by Gwen Hislop, where the classes had been spent in complete silence, with the odd interesting comment about the anatomy of one of the students who was being a model as we went through. One always remembers, of course, the breast massages we did as students. And Gwen Hislop's comment, not much there to grab hold of, or get into it, you've got a good handful there. Or the love bites that would sometimes be evident with the hymns as she went past, and noticed love bites on bits and pieces of one or other student's trunk, neck, various other bits of their anatomy. So I taught massage and I taught electrotherapy, and the joys of solenoids, Faradic batteries, creating coils. I've been very well taught by John Lowe as an undergraduate, and so I really, in many ways, followed some of the format that he had. And it was very didactic teaching, very didactic teaching. I had to do lesson plans that Billy McLeod set up with what were the goals of the class and what were you going to teach, and then what would you put on the blackboard. And of course, the whole format was blackboard based. You didn't have, we had the Gestetner. You would go over to the bowels of Dunedin Hospital and flood yourself with alcohol fumes and run off a few copies of things with that purple ink. But otherwise, it was pretty much blackboard and chalk. And it was a wonder we didn't all get dire illnesses from the chalk dust that emanated off the blackboard. In those days we taught in the lecture theatre in the school in Hanover Street, which was a little amphitheatre. I got one infection after another because it was just a mass of bugs coming down from students all the time to the teacher standing in the front. We would have practical lessons, and of course then they had to think about who was going to examine us, because there was only Renee and I, Frank and Billy, on the staff of the school. There were others to come in the next couple of years, but we were it. We were integrated, of course. Billy was in charge of the whole department as well, so there were many other staff, and many of them had the role of supervisor, physiotherapy supervisor, because the students would work in that area. So we actually integrated in very much into the staff of the hospital in very many ways. We did go through a bad phase when Billy had epaulets in varying colours, and there was at one stage epaulets which had gold braid on them, and they had metal inserts. They were blue felt, gold braid, and if you were a student teacher you had 2 gold braids, which was the same as a supervisor, and then a red stripe as well. They came to a dreadful end when the metal dug into a patient, when one of the physiotherapists, who only had 1 gold stripe, poor person, bent over to treat a respiratory patient, and they were scratched by the metal epaulette. We would bounce around with our epaulets sticking out, and the exams that we had to sit, they decided they would include a triumvirate in each case for the practical exam. Leo Merkin was an orthopaedic surgeon, Enid Gotts, the former principal of the school, and the then Professor of Education. And I was to have an hour and a half, or no, 3 hours of teaching. 3 hours of teaching. The first was to be a theoretical class, teaching some theory about electrotherapy, I think. The second was a electrotherapy practical class, and the third was supervision of a student in a clinical situation, and they were continuous. The triumvirate sat at the back. The students, who I remember included people like Robin Vintner, Mike Monaghan, and Sita, who later became his wife. It was that group of people who were the students, were trying terribly hard to be helpful in the class, which they weren't allowed to be. My mouth was as dry after about half an hour. You just couldn't sustain the anxiety, so I just sort of got on with it. But when we went to do the electrotherapy bit, I was teaching them how to do coils applied to the back, and they went off and made sure that they put the coils absolutely round the wrong way and had everything touching, all sorts of things, to create problems for me to solve in this planned class. I think they'd been put up to it a bit by the examiners, and much hilarity as I had to try and tell them the very obvious, because they did the most amazing things with these coils all over the place. Great big things. They had everything touching. They had twisted them up. They turned them upside down. The short wave machines from which these coils came, had to be very careful that no bits touched, that the arms of the machines were kept at the correct distance, and that was quite a battle, because the arms had very inadequate joints very often that just did not cooperate with the students. One of the students in one year where I was still teaching as a student was Dave Gerard, who was a Commonwealth swimmer and quite notable within the university because of that. And I was teaching electrotherapy, and we were doing thoracic currents and muscle stimulation. And the students this time were being examined, and Dave was a model. And I had asked a student to demonstrate facilitation of quadriceps contraction using a thoracic battery. Dave was terrified of Faradism, of any sort of electrical stimulation. And as the student approached him to put the electrodes on and placed them on the leg at either end of his quadriceps muscle, he then started to get ready to insert the core into the thoracic battery, which was the way in which those old machines were activated, by placing a metal core into a hollow in the machine which would create the circuit so that a contraction resulted, or a stimulus sufficient to cause a contraction. And David nearly fainted. He went completely white. We had to cease the exam and put his head between his legs. Such was the macho image, diminished in about 2 seconds. Renee and I used to have great fun as student teachers. We would go down to the university to do education. We would create opportunities where I would have to go and sample Renee's magnificent Asian cooking, steamboats and fondues before fondues really came in an attempt to try and get to grips with this masses of information that we were just given to read and to write and to sort out in this very didactic manner from the Department of Education. We had our light moments. I did get involved in the Otago branch, and I think I was president or something of the branch, and we were in dire need of funding. So we decided that we would have a very large function where we would invite everybody we knew to a chicken and champagne party. And it was a fundraising effort on behalf of, it was either the school or the branch. Margaret Brentzel was, I think, the branch secretary. Frank Whedon was on the committee. Renee, myself. Gay, Rennie as she was then, she might have been the branch secretary, and Margaret the treasurer. And so we conceived of this chicken and champagne party, which we would have, I think it must have been in the weekend, surely. Remember, we created that guest list, and we created that basically, okay, we want the mayor and all the councillors to come. We want the heads of all the chairs in the university. Anybody else that we can think of who's notable, any of the other named people in Dunedin at the time. So we sent out invitations to all of those people, and it was amazing. Huge numbers of them accepted. We went to Mainland Cheese, which had just begun, and asked for them to provide us with cheese. Mainland Cheese provided all sorts of labelled cheeses. We went to get champagne. Well, now, wine and champagne as it was, Vale wines. We got their champagne, which you wouldn't touch with a barge pole these days, but we got crates and crates of it. Nobody really knew how much you needed for a large function. It was held in what was the new parts of the school. The extensions to the school had not long been open, and it did degenerate a bit. That was evidenced by the then secretary of the Otago Hospital Board turning up in Billy's office on the following Monday with a wine glass in his pocket, which he had taken home. The best bits were the fact that Miss Gotts opened the pool towards the end of the party. She was Mrs. Anderson by then, and invited the various notables, particularly the Professor of Education and wife, and various other hangers-on. I was not a party to this, but a pool party was held in the pool in the school. And given the uprightness of many of these people in the eyes of, well, those of us who'd been students in the not too distant past, and even in fact the rest of the staff, this was quite amazing. And a broken glass was found in the change rooms in the pool on the following weekend. The hangovers were numerous and many. The wine had been oversupplied and completely drunk. We had thought we'd have crates to take back, which we didn't have any. The profits were few and far between. The chicken was a great success. We'd had a mannequin parade as well, and we had to suppress one or two people's husbands who had become quite drunk from making very inappropriate, given that sexist comments weren't known to be sexist and weren't labelled as such then. Their sexist comments were quite amazing during the chicken and champagne mannequin parade.